Welcome everyone to the webinar today. I'm just going to give about a minute to let all of the participants into the room, and then we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stephanie Schwartz-Bailey. I'm the Education Program Manager and Preservation Consultant at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. I'm so pleased to welcome you today to the first of 3 webinars in a series of programs offered in partnership with colleagues in the Florida region. The Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts is a nonprofit full-service facility located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We have since 1977 been providing preservation and conservation treatment, site assessments, education, and leadership in the cultural heritage sector. And the year 2020 was to be the debut of CCAHA South, in which we expand services to Florida in person. But until it is safe to travel again, we are delighted to reach you virtually via webinars, remote consultations, and sharing of resources. Please let me know if you would like any more information regarding working together in collections care. You can email me at sbailey@ccaha.org. Before we turn the program over to our main speaker, Maggie Downing, who is the Manager of Digital Imaging at the Conservation Center, a few introductions. And I'll be back at the end of the webinar to moderate the questions that you might pose into the chat box for Maggie. So first to Carmen Godwin, who is Program Manager of the Florida Association of Museums.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Again, I'm Carmen Godwin. I'm the program manager for the Florida Association of Museums Foundation. I just want to thank the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, as well as our other partners, Florida Humanities, the Society of Florida Archivists, Cultural Builds Florida, which is the Department of State, the Florida Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, Visit Florida, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. And just to say this, that funding for this program is provided by a grant from Florida Humanities with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and additional support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation is provided to CCAHA. So we are very thankful for those sponsors. Next slide, Stephanie. Please, we are going to be sending you an email after this program with a survey. It's very short, just takes a couple minutes. It's not only to help us understand what you thought about this program in particular, but also upcoming programs that you'd like to see us host. Every program that we have offered has come from ideas from you on these surveys. So we really appreciate the feedback. Also want to make you aware of some upcoming programs. The next 2 programs that Stephanie mentioned that we are partnering with them on is internal advocacy on November 18th and fundraising for collections on December 2nd. And then FAM is also hosting a 6-part series on emergency planning and response. The first program is November 20th, and that will focus on threat identification and risk assessment. So each one of those is a different program, and we'd love to have you join with your employees, your teams, to kind of go through that process with us. If you'd like more information on any of our upcoming programs, you can visit us at flamuseums.org. Our Facebook and Twitter handle are also FLA Museums, or you can reach out and email. Melinda Horton is our executive director. That is her address, fam@flamuseums.org, or you can reach me at carmen@flamuseums.org. Thank you so much, Stephanie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tyler McLean. I'm the president of the Society of Florida Archivists, and I very quickly just want to thank our partners for working with us to put together these webinar series and presenting them to our members and to everyone else who's out there. If you're not familiar with the Society of Florida Archivists, I invite you to visit our website or our Facebook or Twitter account. All the links are available there. Or reach out via email if you have any questions, and enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen, and thank you, Tyler. I am now going to invite Maggie to share her screen. Maggie Downing is the manager of digital imaging at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, and she will present the main content of the webinar today.
Okay, super. Thank you, Stephanie. And hi, everyone, and thanks for tuning in today. My name is Maggie Downing, and I'm the manager of digital imaging at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. I'm excited to be talking with you all today about digitization. I'll be discussing the basics of planning a digitization project in an archive, library, or museum. And the focus today will be on still images of archival materials, including books, photographic materials, and flat art. So with the current pandemic, I'm sure we've all had to deal with closures in our institutions to some degree or another, and have faced the challenge of continuing to connect with your audiences and providing access to collections. So one way to do this is through providing access to digital images remotely. And while there's a lot that goes into digitization project planning, which I will discuss, I'll also discuss some strategies for affordable ways to add to your digital online collections during this time. Today I'll be speaking about prioritizing your collections for digitization, file specifications and metadata, file storage and maintenance, some equipment selection tips and workflows. And then I'll discuss some potential funding sources and ways to provide access to digital collections. So I'll spend a good amount of time on the first 4 topics here and then provide some quick tips on the last 2. And I'm also including a link to a handout containing resources that I'll be mentioning throughout. I'm gonna send a link to that in the chat right here. So with that link, you can access all of the resources that I will be mentioning here, and then there'll be some additional resources there as well on these topics. I'll keep an eye on the chat box for anything that needs clarification as I'm speaking, but at the end, Stephanie and I will take most of the questions that you may have about these topics. So this is a lot to cover in 1 hour, so I'm just going to kind of dive right in and start talking about prioritization of collections for digitization. So first, let's talk about why we should prioritize our collections in the first place. So maybe you want to digitize everything in your collection and are ready to just dive in and start scanning box by box until you're done. Well, I imagine that most of you are stewards of roomfuls of diverse materials, and in which case it is critical to find out where you're going to start in order to make sure that you're fulfilling your mission and also maintaining your project momentum and morale. Prioritizing for digitization is a great thing to do, even if you aren't sure how the projects will be funded down the line. And depending on your access to collections records, you may even be able to do some of this planning work from home. So prioritizing and planning out projects will help you advocate for resources to funders and upper administration, When you can show people specifically what the results will be, you can better demonstrate the value of the project. So in these next few slides, I'll discuss different criteria to consider to help stay focused on your institutional mission and digitization goals. These criteria will ultimately help you rank various collections depending on their value to stakeholders, any limiting factors such as copyright or intellectual control, and the physical condition of the materials. So the first thing I recommend in prioritization is to take a big picture look at what you have in your collections. So take a broad view of your collections and consider what the digitization goals are. Think about, what do you want to digitize? I recommend here looking to your mission statement for guidance. Do you have certain collection treasures that you want to focus on? Or do you want to digitize materials related to a certain topic? Think about how much of your collections do you want to digitize and where you will put the material. So for example, do you want to make the images available to the general public on your website or just available locally? And lastly, who is it for? So will these materials mostly be used by museum staff doing research, or local historians or genealogists, or museum visitors and the general public? So during this initial big picture evaluation, it can also be helpful to look at what, if any, collections your institution has already digitized. Look at why these materials were selected for digitization, who uses them and how these collections were digitized, and whether the person doing it did a good job. And also look at where those digital collections are stored and think about if that's sufficient as a place to store your upcoming files for your digitization project. Next, after you have a general idea of what your digitization goals are, you can invite input from other stakeholders, including non-collection staff and upper administration. Not only will they provide valuable insight, they may also feel more invested in your project if they have some input at the beginning. So if you're a museum, consider inviting visitor services or gallery guides who regularly interact with the public. And if you serve a broad public, consider asking for their input as well, perhaps in the form of a survey or in gallery interviews. If you're a research institution, think about inviting scholars. And depending on the size and scope of your collection, you may also benefit from an in-depth scholarly assessment of certain areas of your collection to help set priorities. Some things you want to find out from your stakeholders include which collections or materials are considered the most valuable to the institution, what materials are most popular with visitors or users, what materials hold the highest scholarly value, and then grant or fundraising appeal. So are there specific collections or materials that donors or funders are particularly interested in? And then you may also want to think about visual appeal, thinking about materials that make a nice splash on the website or look good as prints in the gift shop. And from these conversations, you should have a nice wish list of collections that your stakeholders would like to see digitized. And you can start narrowing down the project by asking some more questions to determine any limiting factors to digitization. And these can usually be answered among collection staff. So here you're looking for information that would prevent or make it difficult for you to digitize certain materials. And those things can be like whether a collection has been fully processed and inventoried. So it can be difficult to create a plan to digitize unprocessed collections. So if you have that, you may want to give these a lower priority for digitization until they're processed. Do any of your collections or materials have copyright issues? If so, you may not be able to copy them and make them available for free online. In the handout, I've included some resources on determining copyright and fair use. So I'm not going to go into copyright here, but I have included some good resources that kind of break that down pretty well. Do any materials or collections contain personally identifying information, medical information, or culturally sensitive information? That would require you to redact some information. That may become a lower priority. And then think about how unique the materials are. So many collections contain published materials such as newspapers that may have already been digitized by another institution. So if that's the case, you may not be adding much value by digitizing your own collection of newspapers and can focus your efforts elsewhere. Then you also want to ask some questions about the physical condition of the items you want to digitize. So if you have a conservator, you definitely want to include them in this discussion and to think about where your material is stored. Is there some that is difficult to access or stored off-site? Do any materials require some intervention, such as removing fasteners or taking items out of encapsulation? Do any collections require conservation treatment before they're safe to handle? And are there any collections that are actively deteriorating? And this could be collections of film negatives, very brittle newspapers, anything that you definitely want to capture before further deterioration. From the discussions you've had, you will probably have a huge list of things that folks would love to see digitized and another list of what collection staff feel should not be digitized. Next, you'll be ready to start weighing these criteria and see which collections you should digitize first. Using your findings, determine which of the criteria we discussed would qualify or eliminate a collection or group of materials from being digitized. And you can visualize this with a series of prioritization matrices or flowcharts. And I have as an example here, the selection for digitization flowchart from Harvard University Library. Now, you certainly don't have to create a matrix like this because you may have some obvious projects that filtered through the top just through your conversations. But if you have extensive collections of materials and they're all great, this kind of visualization can help with the prioritization. And it also shows to your superiors and your funders that your selection decisions are not arbitrary. So I'm going now to move on to a discussion of file specifications. So now that we've talked about prioritizing our collections and we have some ideas of where we might want to start, the next thing we want to talk about, to think about is file specifications. So these are the specific file settings that you want to establish before you set out digitizing anything. So first I want to introduce some of the key terms here. Here and in the next few slides, I'll define what I mean when we talk about file format, color, resolution, bit depth, and color space. So file formats, simply put, are conventions for encoding data so that a software program can render it in human readable form. Some of the most common formats for digitized archival materials are TIFF, JPEG, and PDF. Color is easy to define, but super important to think about. This just determines whether you want to capture your materials in color or black and white. And this can make a big difference in your file size and file storage needs. I'll define resolution, bit depth, and color space in the next few slides with some illustrations. The resolution of an image is the amount of detail that it captures. Resolution is measured in pixels per inch, or PPI. You may also see this written as DPI, or dots per inch. Technically, DPI is a term for digital prints rather than digital files, but you'll see these terms used interchangeably. In this example, I've tried to highlight how resolution affects image quality. I've taken a detail of the same image saved at 150 PPI on the left and 800 PPI on the right. And zoomed into this detail of the image, you can see that the 150 PPI detail becomes pixelated and jagged, while the 800 PPI file is smoother. Bit depth measures the number of bits available to be used to represent each pixel in an image. So in the image on the left, each pixel contains 1 bit that can either be black or white. But in the image on the right, each pixel contains 8 bits. So each pixel can be one of 256 shades of gray, which results in a much smoother looking image. Color spaces or color profiles define the range and tones available for a digital file. The theory behind this is a little tricky to explain quickly, and we could really have a whole discussion on color management in its own webinar. But the important thing to keep in mind when selecting a color space for your digitization project is that you want to select one that is widely adopted and has a decent range of colors. And you want to avoid converting back and forth between color profiles, because each time you translate to a new color space, you lose a little bit of the complexity of information in your image. A few common examples are Srgb, which is the smallest range of colors and generally used for web publication. Adobe RGB 1998, which is a medium range of colors and is almost universally accepted by many different softwares and displays. And ProPhoto RGB, which has a huge range of colors and provides a lot of flexibility in editing, but it is newer and a little less widely adopted. If you want to dive a little deeper in understanding color spaces, I recommend this short video linked here, which is also included in the handout, and it does a really good job of visualizing this and breaking this concept down further. Okay. So now that we have a basic understanding of these terms, I want to turn to the various standards and recommendations that exist for digitization. For guidance on specifications for creating digital files, there are standards and recommendations laid out by several organizations, including the American Library Association, the National Archives, and the federal agency's Digitization Guidelines Initiative, or FADGI for short. Each of these is useful in its own way. The ALA guidelines are nice because they're well illustrated, and the other two here are not. The NARA guidelines are helpful in that they discuss workflows beyond capture, including metadata and quality control. But for today, I'll spend a little time talking about the FADGI guidelines for digitizing cultural heritage materials. These are the most recently updated of the 3 and are used by some government institutions. And the information in these guidelines is a good reference point for determining file specifications for your project. So the FADGI guidelines include different file specifications for bound volumes, documents, oversized items, newspapers, prints and photographs, photographic transparencies, paintings, and 2-dimensional art, X-ray film, and microfilm. If anyone here has tried to deal with the FADGI document, you know that it can be pretty intimidating because it's very long, but the bulk of it is made up of the recommendations for each of these types of materials. So there's a lot of repeated information. I've included a sample of the recommendations laid out for the file specifications for scanning prints and photographs as just an example. So these tables outline recommendations on a quality level scale of 1 to 4, as you can see here. But for creating digital surrogates, I recommend only looking to the 3 and 4 star rated recommendations. So that you can see here that TIFFs are recommended for master file formats. And the TIFF format is an uncompressed file format. It's a very large file format, and it can accommodate the resolution, color space, and bit depth that you want out of a master file format. Derivative files or access files can be made in pretty much any format, and these are usually compressed formats that result in smaller file sizes and are more suitable for sharing. We also see recommendations for resolution, bit depth, acceptable color spaces, and color. So this is just an example of where to get started in your guidelines and creating your own local guidelines for your digitization project. It's just a really great place to start. And I've been focusing here on the FADGI guidelines. But I think it's important to reiterate that all of these are just guidelines. And I encourage you all to look at the FADGI as a starting point, but also look at ALA and NARA and consult with other colleagues who have undertaken similar projects to yours. So next I'm going to talk about metadata. And metadata can feel a bit of an abstract concept or maybe a little bit intimidating, but I hope that I can break this concept down a little bit to make it seem more manageable. So I'll start with the definition. Metadata, as defined by the National Information Standards Organization, is structured information that describes, explains, locates, or otherwise makes it easier to retrieve, use, or manage an information resource. To break that down a little further, metadata is information that you record about an object or record. So the herbarium specimen on this slide shows an example of metadata. We have the actual plant, which would be the information resource. And then we also have information about its name, where it was found and when, its catalog number within the museum, a color chart and size chart. And all of this contextual information is an example of metadata. The description helps to describe the plant so that it's useful to researchers. The catalog number helps to locate, retrieve, and manage the specimen. There are different types of metadata for digital files that serve different purposes and include descriptive, administrative, technical, structural, and preservation metadata. Excuse me. So some metadata is the same kind that you may already be recording for physical materials through object records, MARC records, and finding aids, for example. So descriptive metadata describes an item and includes information like the title, date, or the subject, etc. Administrative metadata helps you manage an item and can include information like copyright and access restrictions. But some metadata is just for digital files. So for example, technical metadata includes the scanner or camera information used to create the digital object, the date it was created, and the pixel dimensions, for example. The technical metadata is usually created automatically and is embedded right into your files. Structural metadata records how a file relates to other files, such as whether a file is one page from a book. And preservation metadata is information used in digital preservation and can include information like checksums, a history of data corruption or recovery, information on when files were transferred, and virus scans. Metadata is important to collections, and especially to digitized collections, in that it supports the discovery of your resources through the ability to search electronically, providing valuable insight into your collections. Metadata can also help facilitate the sharing of resources across multiple institutions, which can allow for new relationships among materials to be discovered and shared. Metadata helps you maintain control over access and restrictions if needed. So for example, you can filter out items that are in copyright and choose to make them unavailable on your public-facing website, but may be available on-site to researchers. And lastly, preservation metadata will help you maintain the digital records well into the future. For different types of metadata and for different types of collections, there are a variety of metadata standards or schema. And these standards help to ensure that metadata is applied consistently within an institution and across institutions, which will help make all the work you put into creating it more useful. One example of a metadata schema is Dublin Core, which some of you may be familiar with. Dublin Core is a descriptive schema that includes a set of elements such as title, date, creator, etc. Dublin Core elements are broad and generic enough to describe a wide range of resources and are common in describing web content. Other examples of metadata schema include machine readable encoding, or MARC, which is widely used in libraries, encoded archival description, or EAD, which is common in archives as a means of creating finding aids, describing archives, a content standard, or DAX, which was developed by the Society for American Archivists for describing archival materials. And there are many more than these few examples that I listed here. And this is a pretty quick explanation here, but I've included some more good resources on the handout that go more in depth in explaining metadata in clear terms. So these different metadata schema are supported by controlled vocabularies. And controlled vocabularies are standardized and organized arrangements of words and phrases created to provide a consistent way to describe your data. And using controlled vocabularies in your metadata will help to improve information retrieval. Examples include the Library of Congress name authority file, the Getty Union list of artist names, the Library of Congress subject headings, and the Getty Art and Architecture Thesaurus. So for just one example, I have an image by the photographer Edward Muybridge, and he changed his name a lot over his lifetime and career. So if I was creating descriptive metadata for this photograph, I might consult the Getty Union list of artist names to get the preferred version of his name. We've talked about different types of metadata and controlled vocabularies that can help guide metadata creation at your institution. And while these standards are useful, it's likely that your collections will have some distinct needs, and I recommend creating internal policies and procedures. A document that outlines all of these decisions is called a data dictionary. And data dictionaries document different metadata elements, element names and definitions, obligation of whether a specific metadata element is required or just optional to fill in, and guidance on its use. When drafting a data dictionary and metadata procedures for your institution, consider what metadata you currently use. Who is your audience and what terminologies will they understand? What resources do you have available to create the metadata, including what tools you have, and what skills do your staff or volunteers have, or whoever would be in charge of adding the metadata? And think about who you want to share your metadata with. If you plan to submit to a content aggregator, what are their requirements? So I would recommend for Florida institutions looking at the metadata guidelines for the Sunshine State Digital Network, which is the Florida regional hub for contributing to the Digital Public Library of America. This is not only a great resource to help start you get thinking about metadata, but it will help you understand what metadata you should record to contribute your records to these institutions. So I want to pivot now and talk about different ways that metadata can be associated with your files. So you can record it through a variety of collection management systems, such as the museum system, Embark, Past Perfect, or Content DM, to name just a couple of examples here. And on the image in this slide, I have a screenshot of the collection management system, Embark. And you can see there are lots of different types of metadata that can be entered into the collection management system, including basic description information, loan information, access restrictions, and keywords. And this information can also be recorded in an Excel or Access document for smaller projects, But for large-scale digitization projects, these types of collections management systems will really go a long way in helping you organize your resources. Excuse me. You can also embed metadata directly into the file itself. So some metadata gets automatically embedded, such as technical metadata, at the time the image is created. Other metadata can be embedded within the file, either at the time of capture using your scanning or photo processing software, or on the final files using tools such as Adobe Bridge, of which I have included a screenshot on this slide. So in this example in Bridge, you can see the metadata that's already associated with these files at the top, and then all the fields I can add text into. This would then be embedded into the file info of the digital file. Metadata does not have to be embedded into the file, so long as it is kept in a database and corresponds with the file name or folder name of the digital files. So long as a file name corresponds to an object record in some sort of database, you'll be in good shape. But embedding metadata adds another layer of security to help ensure that the image file is not separated from its content. Excuse me. So now, when you're starting a digitization project, it's important to know what you'll do with the files before you begin. In fact, if you're applying for fundraising, most grants for digitization will require you to demonstrate this. This is because funders, like you, want to protect their investment. Large-scale digitization projects require a considerable investment of time and money, and no one wants to see that investment lost, say, if your hard drive crashes and you didn't have any backups. So next, I'll discuss different types of digital file storage and the importance of redundancy and backups in your file storage. So first, I'll talk about different types of file storage that are available. Most commonly, you have network servers, cloud storage, hosted programs, and removable media. Network servers, which you may see written as network attached or NAS network, are server systems that consist of networked appliances that contain one or more storage drives. These are physical drives and usually kept in a room on site of the business. Cloud storage basically means that your content is stored on the internet. Examples of services include Amazon Web Services and Microsoft Azure. Cloud storage costs vary depending on the amount of space you need, and also on the level of access you need for your files. There are also hosted programs such as Preservica and DuraCloud, which provide secure cloud storage for files and will perform digital preservation activities such as fixity checks. And removable media includes CDs, hard drives, and flash drives. Generally, you should treat removable media as temporary media. For one thing, the media itself can degrade, but more of a threat is media obsolescence. So for example, many computers being manufactured today don't have CD drives. And some laptops, like the one I'm presenting on today, don't even have USB 2 ports. Old hard drives that are formatted on older computers might have trouble opening on newer operating systems such as Windows 10. I highly recommend discussing all options with your IT department or an IT consultant who can help you determine the best storage solutions for your collection and institution's needs. And these options I've discussed here are not meant to be selected one over the other and can be employed together. And that brings me to my next point. Keep your files safe. There are a lot of threats to digital files, including media or file format obsolescence, accidental deletion, viruses, and hacking. But with the right systems in place, these threats can become more manageable. And one of the steps you can take is to establish a good backup procedure. There's a term in digital preservation called LOCKS, which literally just stands for lots of copies keep stuff safe. To keep your stuff safe, you should establish a backup procedure. In general, you should strive toward the principle of 3-2-1, which includes 3 copies of your files on 2 media types with 1 in another geographic location. Meaning if you have files on 2 different local servers with a cloud backup, then you're in good shape. And again, removable media is temporary media. Saving files to a bunch of hard drives as your main storage source is not a good practice, but it can be used as an additional layer of redundancy to your 3-2-1. Another thing you can do to make sure your files are not becoming corrupted over time is to generate a checksum, which is like a digital fingerprint. A checksum is a stream of letters and numbers that change if the bit stream of the file changes. Creating and checking checksums is usually an automated process using a software tool such as Fixity. Checksums will tell you that something is wrong with a file if it is corrupted, but it will not tell you what is wrong with the file. So if you find your file has been corrupted, you can simply replace that file with a backup copy. The link included here, and is also on the resources list, is to the Digital Preservation Coalition Handbook section on Fixity, and discusses some of these tools that are available. Most of them are free. I'll again endorse talking with your IT team if you have one. Consider budgeting for an IT consultant if you're applying for a grant and do not have the infrastructure set up or your expertise on your team. And once your files are in storage, you must continue to manage and monitor them to ensure their ongoing preservation. So be sure to keep this in mind as you plan, that digitization is not a one-effort project. You must continue to monitor your files, continuing to perform Fixity checks periodically. You must maintain your technical infrastructure, performing maintenance on hardware, software, facilities, supplies, and technical components used for storage and access. You should migrate your files as needed. And migration is the conversion of data to the latest file formats or relocation to new storage media as required. You should consider a migration schedule of at least every 5 to 10 years. And be sure to keep track of and monitor your maintenance procedures. The topic of digital preservation is one that's given due attention in other resources, which I'm including on the handout. This is just a very broad overview of digital preservation, but I encourage you all to look through the resources handout. So next, I'll discuss some common types of imaging equipment and tools to do the actual capture, including flatbed scanners, camera and copy stand, and some specialty scanners. And then I'll also discuss some supporting software programs to consider. First, let's talk about flatbed scanners. Pictured here is my humble at-home scanner. And there I have, since I've been working from home, this is what I have in my home office. There are lots of advantages to working with flatbed scanners. For one thing, they are generally pretty small and can fit on a desk or a table in a small space. A scanner is a nice enclosed environment, so you don't have to worry too much about the effect of outside light, which allows you to set it up pretty much anywhere. Scanners are pretty affordable, though professional models can range up to $3,500 or so. They're fairly easy to learn how to use, and they're great solutions for certain types of materials, such as collections of small, unbound, flat documents with stable surfaces, as well as photographic negatives and transparencies. However, flatbed scanners certainly do have limitations. For one, it can be fairly slow in scan speed, depending on the resolution you want to capture. They are not ideal for bound material because it places stress on the bindings, or anything that is warped, anything with friable or flaking media on its surface, because you have to turn the object upside down for scanning, and it will come into direct contact with the equipment. And you're limited also by the size of the scan bed. So any oversized material in your collection would need to be imaged in another way. Next, I want to talk about camera and copy stand setups. I have a snapshot of one of the Conservation Center's studio here as an example. This is certainly a more complex setup than flatbed scanners. And it consists of 2 lights, a digital camera, which is tethered to a computer, which controls the camera shutter, a copy stand, which is the pole that the camera is mounted to. And this one here has measurement markings and is motorized, and a table or surface to put the object on. There are lots of advantages to this kind of setup in that it's very versatile, so it can be used to image lots of types of material. Depending on the camera resolution, it can even capture very large items in a single capture. The capture itself is very fast. It's done in just the time it takes to press the shutter. And it's a modular setup, so you can repair or replace parts of it without replacing the whole system. Another advantage is that the equipment has no contact with the artifact, which makes it a good choice for fragile materials. It can be used to capture books easily, especially with the use of a book easel or cradle support. And the camera can also be taken off of the copy stand and mounted onto a tripod to capture different angles to show, say, the physicality of books, or to digitize 3-dimensional objects in your collection. A camera can also be outfitted to capture negatives by adding a macro lens and photographing them over a light box. Some of the drawbacks for this system is that it is expensive. There's no getting around that. And that can be a big factor, especially in smaller institutions with smaller budgets. There's a high learning curve. Different components require more technical expertise, and there are many more variables that you need to control. You need consistent and even lighting from the correct angles. You need to be conscious of the color of the walls in the studio, even of the color of the clothing of the photographer, the distance of the lighting from the object, and the white balance in the camera, and many more variables. So those are 2 options. Those are some of the most common options, the flatbed scanners and camera and copy stand setups. Between those, you have a lot of versatility and can be used for a wide variety of materials. But I want to mention for just a few moments a few of the options for dedicated scanning for specific types of materials. So first is oversized scanners. These basically work as upside-down flatbed scanners, where the object sits on a large motorized platform and is slowly passed under the scanning element. Unless you have a large and growing collection of oversized materials like maps, it would probably make sense to outsource this type of work rather than purchasing specialized equipment. In the center is an example of a book scanner, and these act as overhead scanners, and these can make a lot of sense if you have a large book collection like a library. Overhead scanners can be used to capture unbound materials as well. So it can be very versatile, but you are just more limited in size with this type of equipment than with the camera or copy stand, camera mounted to a copy stand. And third, on the bottom is an example of a film scanner. And these produce high quality scans and may offer faster scan speeds than a flatbed scanner. But again, unless you have a very large collection of negatives, I think you're best off investing in a more versatile tool like a flatbed scanner or a photography setup to capture negatives. Okay, so now I'll talk about some supporting software for these workflows. If you're producing raw files through your scanner or camera, you'll need a program to process them. These programs will allow you to make batch adjustments to exposure, color balance, cropping, etc. before creating your final files. Lightroom is a good one, and your camera will also come with its own proprietary program that you can use. You'll also want an image editing software. Adobe Creative Cloud is a good option that comes with Photoshop, Lightroom, Bridge, and Acrobat Reader, along with some other programs. GIMP is a free and open source image editing program. That's another good option. And if you're interested in optical character recognition, or OCR, which creates text searchable documents from typed materials, Adobe Acrobat Pro or Adobe Fine Reader are both good. And we use both of those at the Conservation Center. So now I've spent a few minutes talking about equipment for scanning in-house and software to support those workflows. But I also want to mention that there are many companies that will do this work for you, and that outsourcing the digitization is a great option as well. When you outsource digitization, you don't need to worry about purchasing, maintaining and upgrading equipment and capture software. You don't need the technical expertise in-house to operate the equipment. You don't need the staff time for quality control, because the vendor will provide that. And you're guaranteed high production levels and usually a fairly fast turnaround versus doing the project yourself. But with that, you do give up some level of control, and you'll lose some of the time, and you'll spend some time in project management and communicating with the vendor. Of course, there's always a risk to originals in transit. That said, there are companies that can set up to digitize on-site at your institution. And if you're more interested in setting up an ongoing digitization project program, then purchasing equipment may be the better option for you. But these are just some of the things to think about as your project comes together. All right, so we've talked about all the steps that go into creating your digital images. And now I want to take just a few minutes and talk about some methods for sharing your images online. So there are some tools, including Omeka and Flickr, which allow you to create galleries and add keyword tags, which can be a great way to get started with sharing images of your collection with the public. And both of these tools are free. Social media is also a great way to connect. You can share your images of your collection on Facebook or Instagram or YouTube if you have video content. Requiring more planning, but worth the investment, would be integrating your collections management system with your website. This will likely cost money and require more technical support than creating web galleries on Omeka or Flickr, but will allow you to provide more robust information about your collection items. And integrating your content with the Sunshine State Digital Network and the Digital Public Library of America will also require considerable planning, but with the high reward of reaching researchers and connecting with collections across the country. So here's a screenshot of the San Diego Air and Space Museum's Flickr page with different albums. And on the right is a screenshot of one image, which has a brief description and a few keyword tags so that it can be searched for. And there's also a place for public comment, which can be cool if you're trying to engage in conversation with the public about your image. So Flickr is really a social media tool. It's easy to use and navigate, and it's familiar to lots of people that may be accessing your collections. And here's a screenshot of an object record from the Franklin Roosevelt Library and Museum Artifact Collection, which you can see integrates a much more robust information from the object record, which is maintained in their collections management system. Again, this can take some time and resources to accomplish, but this is something that grant funding can help with. In the meantime, for more immediate upload of your images to the internet, Omeka and Flickr, social media, etc. Those are all quicker ways to put your images online and engage with your audiences. So on the subject of fundraising, I only have time to mention this briefly, but I do want to point out some opportunities for grant funding. There are lots of opportunities for funding for large-scale digitization projects through the CLEAR, Digitizing Hidden Special Collections and Archives, the NEH Humanities Collections and Reference Resources, IMLS Inspire grants for small museums, IMLS Museums for America, National Historical Publications and Records Commissions, Save America's Treasures, and any state, county, and municipal agencies may also have funding opportunities for digitization projects. Just earlier this month, I presented on this topic with the Conservation Center's Director of Development, Lee Price, and you can view that on the Conservation Center YouTube page, and I have a link to that in the resources handout as well. And Lee goes in much more in depth about each of these opportunities and gives tips on how to apply. But I just wanted to say here that you don't necessarily have to increase your general operating budget to fund big projects. There are lots of opportunities for grant funding as well. So, I know that this was a lot of material to cover in 1 hour, and there's a lot to digest. But just to recap quickly, first, prioritization is an important first step. It's something you can work on even if you don't know when your projects will be funded. It's important to define file specifications and what metadata you want to capture at the beginning of your project. And equally important is having a plan for preserving your files for the long term. Digitization requires a lot of resources, and you don't want to have to redo your work. I talked also about some equipment for digitization in-house and some considerations for outsourcing to a vendor. And I mentioned a few ways to make your materials accessible online and a few funding sources. So now it's super important to write all of these decisions that you're going to be making down. Even if your project doesn't get completed, or you don't want to have to redo all of the work you do to create these decisions. So formalize your decisions. These can be recorded in the form of a digitization plan, a selection policy, a digital preservation policy, and also less formal documentation. And I've included samples of many of these in the resources handout, so you can look to those as examples. So at this point, I'm happy to take some time and answer some questions that may have come up. And I also am putting my email address here on the screen. I know, again, that this is a lot to digest. So if you think of something later, feel free to email me. So I think Stephanie will be helping me with the questions in the chat.
I will. Thank you, Maggie, for that excellent presentation. There's so much to consider before embarking on a digitization project, and you've made the steps and the importance of all of them so clear. So thank you.
Of course.
I have been watching the chat box. I think it's hard when it starts to scroll, but I can tell you where your first question is. And I can read it if you like.
Sure.
Okay, it's from Kiki, and it's an equipment question.
Great.
So Kiki writes, are flatbed scanners appropriate to use to digitize silver gelatin prints and black and white photos? Works on paper such as chalk, charcoal, or watercolor drawings, or etchings, etc. Basically, you know, how much do you have to think about the friable media concern? Or is it better just to think about photographing with a camera, no flash? Or is there an even more appropriate way to digitize fine artwork?
Okay, I'll start. So I'll start with the photos. If your photos are stable, I see no problem in digitizing them with the flatbed scanner, so long as they fit on the scan bed. that should be fine. Works on paper with chalk or charcoal, I would not recommend using a flatbed scanner just because that material tends to be fairly loose on the surface. But etchings, aquatints, lithographs, anything without media that's loose on the surface should be fine on a flatbed scanner. Again, limited to the size of the scan bed. And photographing with the camera and flash is fine when you're just digitizing, because you're not doing repeated exposure. So when you digitize, you do have light exposure, but the idea is not to have a sustained and repeated light exposure. And then, you know, for a limited budget, I would look into the highest resolution camera you can afford, and a copy stand and continuous lighting. It is going to be expensive, so flatbed scanning and whatever collections you can get by with on your flatbed scanner is one way to get some digitization projects off the ground until you can get some funding for a camera copy stand setup. I hope that helps.
Yeah, there's a lot to consider.
Yeah.
And I suppose there's a lot of looking at the art and archival material before even considering digitizing. Can you make any comment on that process and how to prioritize which archival material might be straight out right away out of the question for digitization?
Sure. I guess as far as condition and handling, anything where there's stuff that's falling into pieces as you handle it, because you know you need to turn pages of a book, you need to flip pages over. Anything that can't be handled safely should be looked at by a conservator first. And I guess as far as like content-wise, you want to look at copyright. If you have a lot of works in your collection that are for sure under copyright by an artist, you can't necessarily just go and digitize it and put it online, unfortunately. So one way to start getting momentum in a digitization project is to start with things that you know are in the public domain. So those are usually older materials.
Thank you. It's actually a great time to be thinking about digitization projects and institutions as well while some of us are working at home.
Yes, yeah, I know. And the planning part and the thinking about things like this is something you can do from home. And you can start having these conversations with other non-collection staff about what they think are important in your collections, and start brainstorming and getting some ideas together.
Do you have any tips, Maggie, for working within your institution with other staff members who maybe come from other backgrounds and have other priorities? As you're thinking about starting a digitization project, how do you incorporate all of those ideas and motivations to be on your side to start this digitization project?
Yeah, I think one really important thing is to go in to these conversations with an agenda and also like your big picture idea for the project. You want to have some sense of what you want to do before you get there, the input of non-collection staff to kind of focus the conversation and be able to moderate that conversation, because people will have come into these meetings with a lot of different levels of interest in the project. So making sure that you don't go down one rabbit hole in your conversation. And these are just kind of broad recommendations for conducting those meetings. But I think having some thoughts of what you want it to look like in the big picture sense and having a focused meeting and an agenda will really go a long way.
Great advice. Maggie, there's a comment in the chat box from Tim who writes, FYI, The Florida Division of Historical Resources has been regularly funding digitization projects the last few years under our small matching grants program.
Super. Yes. that's awesome. So everyone definitely check them out. That's the Florida Division of Historical Resources, the small matching grants program. And just as a tip, in a lot of instances in these grants that require a match from your institution, some of the staff time that goes into creating metadata and project management can count as in-kind funds for the match that is required for a grant.
Well, thanks very much, Maggie, for all the information and feedback that you've given on the webinar today. The chat box seems to have slowed down, so I think we can close up the webinar today, and I hope that lots of you and your staff and your colleagues will come back and join us in November for the next webinar in the series.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.